Well, if you're a guest with us today, we are on a journey as a church to study our way through the gospel according to Luke. We're looking at what did Jesus do, what did he say, and therefore what is required of us as his followers. Now, last week we saw Jesus and his proclamation that he was Lord of the Sabbath, that how the Sabbath is designed for us to be able to rest and to rejuvenate and to be in connection with God, not so that we can tell God what to do. Jesus demonstrated that mercy toward other people is more important than any man-made practices that we may come up with. And so today we continue this idea of authority. And we're going to look at where did Jesus get his authority and how did that impact the people around him, and ultimately how does that impact us? And so we pick up the story in Luke chapter 6, verse 12. Luke wrote, "During those days, Jesus went out to the mountain to pray and spent all night in prayer to God." Then the first thing I want us to see today is that Jesus' authority came through his dependence on prayer. We begin seeing that his authority is rooted in his prayer. It was a custom of Jesus. We see this over and over again, that Jesus would go off and spend time alone with the Father in prayer. Luke gives us examples of this. Earlier, Luke wrote that after Jesus had spent all night in Capernaum, he had spent the night healing. He said, when it was day, he, being Jesus, went out and made his way to a deserted place. And similarly, after he had healed the leper and he had ministered to a group of people, Luke wrote, yet he often withdrew to deserted places and prayed. See, Jesus understood that if he was going to fulfill his role on earth, it was necessary for him to get away to have private prayer time. He had to root his life in prayer. But I want us to look at something that I think is even more striking. It says here in our passage that he spent the night praying. Now, the Greek word that we have translated as all night or spent the night, it doesn't mean an extended period of time. It literally means from sunset to sun up, all night. Now, I know that sunset to sun up varies depending on the time of the year, and for today, cloud cover. I understand that. But let's just put this in a little bit of perspective. Officially, last night, sunset was at 7:56. And officially, sunrise this morning was at 5:48. Just shy of 10 hours. 10 hours. 10 hours of praying. I don't know about you, but I will just Joe confession time. I've been known to be praying in my bed at night, fall asleep in the middle of a sentence, and finish it the next morning when I wake up. And yet Jesus prayed all night. If I stopped right now and called us to prayer, after about 60 seconds, some of you will get very uncomfortable because you've got nothing else to pray for. And yet Jesus prayed all night. And it wasn't just a generic listing of prayers. I don't think Jesus walked up to the location where he was going to meet the Father with this list of, hey, Mrs. Smith's still in the hospital and Mr. Jones needs a hit. I don't think this was a concerted moment, time of prayer. So maybe the question is why? Why was Jesus so intense with this conversation, this prayer with the Father? Jesus had a huge decision to make. He was about to call 12 men to be his disciples. And when I say that, right now we're talking about disciples with a capital D, or later we're going to call them apostles. See, Jesus had lots of little d disciples, followers, if you will. But these 12 are going to have a special role. They're going to continue his work after Jesus' crucifixion, after his resurrection, after his ascension back into heaven. These are the men that are going to continue his work. These are the men that are going to establish his church. This was an important decision. I want to remind us, because we go, wait a minute, Jesus knew everything. We got to go back up several Sundays, but to remind us that Jesus didn't, in his human form, know everything that he did not need to know. What? See, Jesus, when he stepped out of heaven, he turned over some of his godly attributes to the Father. And when the Father wanted him to heal somebody, he had the power. When the Father wanted him to know something, he knew it. It wasn't just automatic. And this is why Jesus had to go and spend the night with the Father, to gain the knowledge, to gain the understanding, so the Father could reveal to him the 12 people that he was going to choose. See, what we see here is that prayer was everything to Jesus. This is how he received his power. Through prayer is how he received his knowledge. Through this dependent prayer, Jesus was able to live a perfect life, a sinless life. And yes, I understand that Jesus is the eternal Son, that he created everything, that he is the Alpha and the Omega, that everything is moving toward him and will culminate in him. But in his human life, he could not do it apart from a dependent prayer with God the Father. Our application number 1 today is, I think, fairly logical. Our effectiveness comes through our dependence on prayer. If Jesus, the Son of God, could not function without dependent prayer, how much more essential is it for you and me? What arrogance it is of us when we understand that Jesus knew that prayer was important. When we understand that Jesus practiced prayer on a regular basis. When Jesus poured his life into prayer so that he could be in one relationship with the Father. How arrogant it is of us to think that we don't need it. How arrogant it is of us to not place prayer as a priority in our life. See, I think as the modern church, and again, I am speaking generically because some of you, your prayer life is amazing. It is obvious when you hear certain people pray, because you can't pray like that and not have practice praying like that, okay? It's something that you do on a regular basis, and I'm very grateful for you. But I'm afraid that the church is filled with people that don't engage in dependent prayer, but in routine prayer. You know, the kind of prayer that you've got to pray, it's a checklist prayer. Okay, I've got to say my prayers. I've got to read my Bible. I'm not saying God can't use it. I'm not saying it's not a good starting point. But a routine prayer doesn't have power to it. Jesus didn't say, apart from me, you can do something. He said, apart from me, you can do nothing. One of the reasons that I think the modern church isn't as effective as it should be, as it could be, is that we don't pray. And therefore, we don't receive the power of Jesus. Prayer must be a priority in the life of a Christian. So Jesus prayed all night, and then Luke continued the story in verse 13. When daylight came, he summoned his disciples, and he chose 12 of them, whom he also named apostles. Simon, who he also named Peter, and Andrew his brother, James and John, Philip and Bartholomew, Matthew and Thomas, James the son of Alphaeus, Simon called the Zealot, Judas the son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. So what we see is that Jesus' authority led to effective choosing of the 12. See, the sun comes up, and Jesus knows the Father's will. There's no more questioning. There's no more what ifs. These are the 12. And so what did he do? He acted. With decisive authority, he put the plan into action. And I want you to understand this was sovereign election. None of the 12 had sought this appointment. Now, later on, we're going to see some of the disciples are kind of like jockeying for position within the disciples, but none of them started off, none of them, as Jesus called them, felt like that they were going to be moving into a place of position. But Jesus is about to send them out to become his official messengers, ambassadors, if you will, to the nations. They're going to have special powers. They're going to have special authority. And after Pentecost happens, after Jesus' ascension and Pentecost happens, they're going to become the official witnesses and the leaders of the new community that we call the church. Some of them are going to go on to be inspired writers of the New Testament. And every one of them will give their lives telling others about the good news of Jesus Christ, except for one. We'll mention him in a few seconds. We don't actually know the order that they were named. Luke begins the list with Peter. And this kind of makes sense. He eventually becomes, by the time Luke is writing this, Peter's kind of the leader. He's been the leader of the group. So Peter's listed first. And then Judas Iscariot, who betrays Jesus, who hangs himself and replaced by Matthias. There's our 12. He's listed last. Matthew and Mark, in their account, do a similar thing. They both list Peter first and Judas Iscariot last, but their order inside that changes just a little bit. They switch names back and forth. Doesn't really impact anything, except we do have a concluded list of 12 men. You know, today, every name in this list, as I read through that list, you didn't go, whoa, wait a minute. I don't recognize that name. Where did he come from? We all recognize these names. Even we don't know hardly anything about Bartholomew or Judas, the son of James. We don't know a lot about some of these guys, but we still know them, don't we? But when Jesus chose them, they were all unknowns. All except Judas Iscariot was Galileans. In other words, they were country boys. 4 of them, at least 4 of them were fishermen. One was a hated tax collector. He was probably the only one of these guys that had any money, any wealth to his name. Not one of them was a scribe or a priest or an elder or a ruler, as they were, as their opponents would later label them, just ordinary men. And yet they formed the nucleus of a band that changed the ancient world and has been changing the world ever since. All the way up to right now. In his vision of heaven, John recorded this, that the city wall had 12 foundations, and the 12 names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb were on the foundation. When we get to heaven, we're going to see the names of these ordinary, no-name bunch of men inscribed on the 12 foundations of the New Jerusalem. With Matthias replacing Judas Iscariot. Here's our application number 2. Our effectiveness comes when we listen to Jesus. See, when Jesus calls ordinary men and women to serve him, his call is always effective. In other words, it changes something. It does something. It affects us. And it is regardless of our abilities or lack thereof. Now we're going to go Old Testament for a few moments. Some of y'all remember back in the Old Testament, back in Judges, there's this guy by the name of Gideon. He wasn't handing out Bibles or anything like that at that time, okay? But Gideon, God calls Gideon to lead an army against the Israelite army against the Midianite army. And Gideon objects. He says, I can't do this because I'm too common. I am the least of my family, the least of my clan, the least of my group. In other words, when you look at Gideon says, when you look at all the people in Israel and you rank them, I'm on the very bottom. And God says, good. That's who I'm looking for. You are the guy I can use to do something amazing. Gideon is going to have to learn how to trust God for everything. And here's a summary of the dependence part of the story in the book of Judges. The Midianite army was huge, about 135,000 men. So Gideon goes and he recruits the biggest army he can find, and that ended up being about 32,000 men. Let me repeat this. The Midian army is about 135,000 men, and Gideon now has 32,000 men. And God says, Gideon, you've got way too many people. And through a series of reduction, Gideon ends up with 300 men. Now, let me just put this into a little more perspective. From people that understand this kind of stuff a lot more than I do, they tell me that back then, from a military standpoint, the proper odds for launching a campaign against another king, another army, is 3-1 in my favor. So I need 3 times as many men as you have for me to go, hey, I think this is what I'm going to do. When Gideon amassed 32,000 troops, the odds were a little over 4-1, not in his favor. When he drops down to 300 men, the odds now are 450-1. Nobody in their right mind is going to launch that kind of campaign. It's not going to work. It is insane. But it was during this conscious, because Gideon had to agree to this conscious abandonment of his natural abilities, natural power, that he had to place all of his dependence upon God. And when we get to that kind of place like Gideon, God is pleased to work. God is pleased to step up and go, yes, let me show you my power. Through God's power, Gideon and the 300 men defeated the Midianite army. See, one of the supreme glories of God is that He can shine when we're weak. Our commonness makes room for His power. The Scottish Baptist pastor, some of you might recognize, Oswald Chambers, he wrote this: all through history, God has chosen and used nobodies because their unusual dependence on Him made possible the unique display of His power and grace. These words ought to encourage us, because I just want you to know, with all the love in my heart, most of us are just common people. Most of us right here, we're just common. We're ordinary. And to know that God can take somebody that's common, that's ordinary, and use us for His glory to build His kingdom ought to encourage us. It ought to motivate us. See, an awareness of one's weakness, of one's commonness, if you will, may be our greatest asset to the gospel ministry. Because it's when we know that we can't do this on our own that all of a sudden we have the desire to be dependent upon God. We know that we've got to depend upon Him. Conversely, we can do right the opposite also. When we begin to think a little bit of ourselves, and especially when we get to think a lot about ourselves, we don't need God. We don't need God. I think Jesus' example of how difficult it is for a rich man to get into heaven is that right there. They don't need God. And before we start naming people that are, really rich, let's remind ourselves that in the world economy, we're rich. Because we have a home, and we have a car, and we have food, and we have clothes, and we have cell phones, and we have cable, and we have, the list can go on and on and on. And it's so easy for us to go, I got this. But when we are reminded that we don't got this, then we can depend upon God. In writing to the church in Corinth, the Apostle Paul addressed this concept. He wrote that Jesus had said to him, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is perfected in weakness. And because of that, Paul proclaimed, therefore I will most gladly boast all the more about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may reside in me. This is hard. This is almost a paradox in our society, but we've got to, as a church, as Christians, we've got to embrace this. That for 2,000 plus years, God has used men and women that recognize their weaknesses and depended upon God's strength, and that His power flows through them and can flow through us when we recognize Him and we depend upon Him. So Luke finishes the story by putting the newly appointed 12 to work, starting in verse 17. After coming down with them, after Jesus coming down with the disciples, he stood on a level place with a large crowd of his disciples and a great number of people from all Judea and Jerusalem and from the seacoast of Tyre and Sidon. They came to hear him and to be healed of their diseases, and those tormented by unclean spirits were made well. The whole crowd was trying to touch him because power was coming out from him and healing them all. I want us to see here Jesus' authority fueled his ministry. Jesus chooses the 12, and in our day and time, if we have something big like that happen, we've had this big meeting and we've selected 12 guys, what would be our next step? Our next step would probably be, let's eat. Our next step is, hey, let's go celebrate. Let's go have some cake. Let's celebrate what has just happened. And Jesus said, hey, you 12, let's go to work. He immediately goes down the mountain to meet the people where they are. He teaches, he heals, he casts out unclean spirit. Luke says again, the power was people were just wanting to touch him because if they could touch him, they could feel the power of God. Who does he have with him? The 12. Just moments before, they are informed, hey guys, I've got a special task for you. And now he puts them to work. What the 12 saw from the very beginning is that this is not a position of prestige. This is not a position of honor. This is a position of let's get to work. And unfortunately, I'm afraid the modern church has forgotten this. We're more concerned about being comfortable. We're more concerned about somebody doing what I want, what I like. We're more concerned about me than we are for serving. Jesus has called us to serve. And now I'm getting into the last application, so let's move there. Our following Jesus fuels our ministry. When does your ministry in God's kingdom start? The moment you accept Jesus as your Lord and Savior. The moment that he calls you to himself, he calls you to go out. I'm afraid too many Christians think church is the end of the road. They live for a worship service or a retreat or a speaker to get them excited. And let me say, that's okay because there's a place for all of those. But that's not the end. It's the beginning. To put it into some sports terms, it's a pep rally. It's a pep rally to go out to the game. Now, does anybody, some of y'all got to think back a long time. Maybe some of you, you're so old, they didn't have pep rallies when you were in school. I don't know. But I think back to those Friday afternoon pep rallies. And everybody comes into the gym and the cheerleaders are there and the football players are there and they're trying to get everybody's up and yelling and screaming and we're getting excited. We're doing all. But what if we just stopped there? What if we all got excited, the football team got all pumped up, and then everybody just went home? The visiting team shows up at the football field and guess what? Ain't nobody to play because all the football players went home. The idea is that you get excited at the pep rally so that you can go and win the game. Church, this is not the end. This is the beginning. When you walk out those doors, you ought to be excited to go out into a world that needs to hear about Jesus Christ. If you are following Jesus, if you are dependent upon Him, if you are in a constant prayer with Him and He is leading you and guiding you, He is going to lead you to the people that are hurting. He is going to lead you to the people that are hungry. He is going to lead you to the people that need healing, because that is where He goes. And when we follow Him, guess what? That's where we go. Jesus went off to the mountain to pray, but He did not stay there. He always came back down the mountain to the people. I'm sure some of you have been there. I've been there, where you go on the retreat, you go on the mission trip, you go on this, you go on. And it's as we would say, a mountaintop experience. You get so excited and you're thinking, man, I could just live here forever because I'm so close to God. And He says, no, go back home, because that's where the people are. That's where the people are. That's what He expects of us. We spend time in prayer. We spend time seeking His guidance so that we can go to the people. Jesus' authority came through His prayer, through His connection with God the Father. And it sent Him out. And He expects the same of the 12. He expects the same of us. My question for you today, are you doing that? Are you going? And if you're not, the first thing you may want to check is your prayer life. Because generic prayers don't guide us the way that dependent prayer does. So what is Jesus asking of you today? What is He asking of you right now? If you've never accepted Jesus as your Lord and Savior, that's the first thing. I'll be here at the front in a few moments as we sing a song, and I'd be happy to talk with you about your relationship with Jesus. Maybe today Jesus has said, I've been trying to call you to be one of my disciples, and you just hadn't been listening. But today's the day. Start now. Don't put it off. Don't wait. Right now. Will you stand with me as I pray?